Everything in the Okafor household moved with rhythm and intention. From the clatter of spoons against ceramic plates in the kitchen to the sound of gospel music floating from the living room speakers, the house felt alive. It wasn't just big, it was warm. It was the kind of home where love seemed to drip from the very walls. The children knew it. David, 16, tall and already growing into his father's serious face, carried himself with the quiet pride of the firstborn. Grace, 14, was the talkative one, always scribbling in notebooks, always arguing like a lawyer in training. And Samuel, only 9, was the sunshine of the house, a little boy with too much energy and too much laughter, always running, always asking questions. Together, they were bound by something deeper than wealth. They had parents who made the world feel safe. That Friday morning was just like the others. Grace sat at the dining table, bent over her toast, muttering about how David had stolen her pen the night before. "I didn't steal it," David replied, reaching for the jug of milk. "You leave your things everywhere. Maybe Samuel took it." Samuel's eyes widened. "Me? I don't even like pen. I like biscuits." The table burst into laughter, their mother shaking her head as she walked in, a silk scarf tied loosely around her hair. "David, don't tease her," she said, kissing Grace on the forehead. "And Samuel, stop thinking of biscuits. You'll eat real food first." Their father joined soon after, crisp in his suit, his cologne filling the room before he even sat down. He tapped his newspaper and looked at David. "So, young man, are you ready to take over my companies yet?" David smirked. "Not yet, sir. But one day I will be greater than you." Everyone laughed, even Samuel, though he didn't really understand the joke. Their father's laughter was deep, the kind that made the walls hum. "That's my son," he said, reaching for his tea. The house was full of those little moments. Grace pestering her mother about joining a debate club, Samuel trying to sneak an extra piece of fried plantain, David pretending to be too mature for cartoons but still sitting through them. To outsiders, it looked like the perfect family, but to the Okafors, it was just life. On weekends, they played Ludo in the parlor. Sometimes their father danced with their mother to old High Life songs while the children groaned, "Mummy, Daddy, please, stop embarrassing us." But even in their complaints, there was laughter. Love was the foundation of everything. And though the children didn't know it, these golden days were preparing them for storms they could never imagine. That afternoon, the house buzzed differently. Their parents were traveling to Abuja for business, an oil and gas meeting for Mr. Okafor, an education summit for his wife. It wasn't unusual, but for some reason, David kept following his father around, asking questions. "Daddy, will you bring me that science book I told you about?" he asked as his father adjusted his tie. "What book again?" his father teased. "The one with the solar experiments. You promised." His father chuckled. "I'll bring 2. One for you and one for your future company." Grace rolled her eyes. "Science again? Daddy, please buy me a big notebook. I need to write my speeches." "You'll get it," their mother said, smiling. She bent low to tie Samuel's shoelace. "And what about you, my baby? What do you want?" "Chocolate," Samuel replied quickly. Everyone laughed again. Their mother kissed him. "Of course chocolate." They left shortly after, waving as the car rolled out of the compound. The children returned to their games, their laughter, their routines. The evening stretched, then night. By midnight, no call had come. By morning, the silence grew heavier. And by the next evening, there was a knock at the gate. The security man hesitated before letting them in, 2 men, one in uniform, the other in a brown suit with eyes swollen from lack of sleep. David stood in the living room, Grace and Samuel beside him, hearts pounding. The man in uniform removed his cap. "Is this the Okafor residence?" he asked softly. David nodded, throat dry. The man sighed. His lips trembled before he spoke. "We're very sorry to inform you." The words after that didn't make sense. They came like echoes, muffled and cruel. Grace's notebook fell from her hand. Samuel screamed and clung to David's leg. David didn't cry. He couldn't. He just stood there, staring at the men, his fists clenched, his chest heaving, trying to hold together a world that had already shattered. And just like that, the golden days were gone. The Okafor mansion no longer felt alive. Days after the burial, silence clung to its walls like cobwebs. The perfume of their mother no longer lingered in the corridors. The deep voice of their father no longer rolled through the halls. Instead, the house stood still, watching like an empty witness as mourners drifted away and life outside continued. Inside, David sat by the edge of his father's study, staring at the leather chair that still bore the shape of the man who once filled it. Grace sat on the staircase, notebook in her lap, but no words flowing, only lines of ink trailing where her tears had fallen. Samuel clutched his teddy bear, his small face swollen from days of crying. The mansion, once filled with laughter, was now an echo of grief. But David told himself one thing: at least they still had the house. At least they still had each other. That fragile hope crumbled the moment the uncles arrived. 3 black SUVs rolled into the compound one afternoon, their engines loud, their presence heavier than grief itself. Out stepped Uncle Edward first, his red Isiagu embroidered with golden lions stretched across his stomach. His cap tilted proudly as though he owned the ground beneath his feet. Beside him, Uncle Matthew, lean and sharp-eyed, wore a dark brown Isiagu with a beaded walking stick in his hand, the type that carried whispers of shrines and charms. Last was Uncle Felix, quiet but unsettling, his white senator-style outfit starched to perfection, his red beads clicking against his wrist with each step. Together they looked less like mourners and more like kings arriving to claim a throne. And behind them, adjusting his glasses and clutching a worn leather briefcase, was the family lawyer, Barrister Okoye. He didn't greet anyone. His eyes swept over the mansion, calculating, already measuring its worth. David stood quickly, trying to look taller than his 16 years. Grace rose beside him, pulling Samuel close. "Good afternoon, uncles," David said, his voice steady though his heart raced. None of them replied. Instead, Barrister Okoye opened his briefcase with a flourish, papers sliding out like blades. "Your father," he began, "left no will. According to custom and family authority, everything he owned now belongs to his brothers." The words struck like thunder. Grace gasped. "That's not true." "Daddy planned everything, he told us. Her voice cracked. Uncle Edward chuckled, his cap bobbing. "Anwanutineta, your father didn't tell you everything. You are children. You know nothing. The decision was not a discussion. It was a sentence. Pack your things?" Uncle Matthew barked, tapping his beaded stick on the tiled floor. "You cannot stay here. This is no longer your home." David's chest tightened. "This is our house. My father built this." His voice trembled, but he stood firm. Uncle Felix tilted his head, his tone soft but sharp as a knife. "And now your father is gone. You are nothing without him." Samuel's voice broke into the air, thin and terrified. "Uncle, please, don't send us away. Where will we go?" He clutched at Edward's Isiagu, tiny fingers gripping with desperate strength. Edward shoved him back, muttering, "Senseless boy." Grace screamed, rushing to catch Samuel before he fell. Her tears came hot and fast, but her voice carried the fire of defiance. "You can't do this. We are his children. We belong here." Barrister Okoye closed his briefcase slowly, his silence louder than words. He had already chosen his side. 2 guards appeared from nowhere, carrying small travel bags David recognized. His school bag. Samuel's bag with his name stitched on it. The sight made his stomach twist. Their fate had already been decided. Grace knelt on the floor, clutching Samuel, crying openly now. Neighbors peered over the high fence, whispering, pointing. The once proud Okafor children, stripped, humiliated, thrown to the wind. David clenched his fists so tightly his nails bit into his skin. Every muscle in his body screamed to fight, to scream, hell to throw himself at the men who stole his family's world. But one look at Grace's tear-streaked face and Samuel's trembling body told him the truth. He couldn't fight this battle now. He had to survive it. He had to protect them. "Let's go," David said quietly, his voice breaking but firm enough to guide his siblings. Grace looked up at him, horrified. "David, we can't leave. This is our house." Her words pierced him, but he forced himself not to falter. He bent down, wiped Samuel's tears with shaking hands, and whispered, "It's okay. I'm here. We'll be fine." Samuel nodded, trusting him, though neither of them knew where the road would lead. The uncles turned their backs, already discussing which property to sell first. The lawyer adjusted his cap, avoiding their eyes. And just like that, the gate creaked open. David picked up the 2 small bags, one in each hand, and took his siblings by the other. Together, they walked down the long driveway where they once rode bicycles, where their mother once called them in for dinner. The mansion loomed behind them, tall and proud, betraying no sign that its true owners had just been cast out. The neighbors kept whispering. The guards didn't look at them, and when the gate shut with a heavy metallic clang, it sounded final, like a door locking on their childhood forever. The street outside Legos didn't pause to notice them. Yellow buses screamed for passengers, hawkers shouted prices. Life surged on, merciless and unbothered. David stood frozen for a moment, staring at the world that had just swallowed them. Grace pressed her face into her palm, her sobs muffled but raw. Samuel tugged at David's shirt, whispering in the voice of a broken child. "Where will we sleep tonight?" David swallowed hard, staring ahead. He didn't know. He had no answers, but he tightened his grip on their hands and took a step forward. "Anywhere," he whispered. "As long as we're together." And with that, the Okafor children walked into the streets, heartbroken, homeless, and betrayed. The storm had only just begun. Legos did not care that they were children. The city moved with its own rhythm, loud, merciless, and unbothered. Yellow buses screeched for passengers, their conductors hanging from the doors, shouting destinations in rapid-fire Yoruba and Pidgin. Hawkers chased cars with bottled water, gala, groundnuts, and plantain chips. Beggars dragged tin bowls from one window to another, their voices swallowed by the blaring horns. In that chaos, 3 children wandered, holding hands like a fragile chain against the storm. David walked in front, his shoulders squared though his heart was breaking. Grace followed, her notebook clutched to her chest as if it held their last shred of dignity. Samuel stumbled beside her, too small to keep up, his voice trembling. "David, are we going home?" His words cut like glass. David squeezed his hand tighter. "This is home now, Sam," he said, forcing strength into a voice that felt hollow. Grace looked at him, her eyes wet. "Where will we sleep?" David didn't answer. Instead, he kept walking, one foot after the other, as though movement itself could shield them from the truth. That night they tried sleeping by the gates of a small Pentecostal church, hoping the man on night duty would pity them. He chased them away with a stick. They ended up in front of a locked shop, mosquitoes biting their legs, Grace trying to sing softly to calm Samuel, though her own voice cracked with exhaustion. By dawn, their stomachs growled with hunger, and Legos woke up around them, uncaring. Days blurred into one another. They drifted from street to street, surviving on little kindnesses. A woman selling akara once gave them 2 balls for free, whispering, "God will help you." A bus driver threw leftover bread at them, laughing as Samuel scrambled to catch it. Grace's health weakened. She coughed often, her face pale, her steps slower each day. Samuel cried at night, sometimes whispering, "I want Mummy." Each word was a dagger to David's chest. He refused to cry in front of them, though tears burned his eyes every time he turned away. He began doing odd jobs just to keep them alive. He washed cars for men who paid him a 50, their eyes pitying, sometimes mocking. He carried heavy bags in the market, his arms shaking under the weight, his back aching long after the job ended. Some days he earned enough for bread and sachet water. Some days, nothing. Yet he always split it 3 ways, never eating more than his siblings. One evening, after working from sunrise to dusk, he came home with only 100 in his pocket. Grace's lips were cracked. Samuel's stomach rumbled audibly. David bought a small plate of rice, just enough for 2. He pushed it toward them. "Eat," he said. "What about you?" Grace asked, her voice thin. "I'm not hungry," David lied, though his stomach screamed. He watched as they ate slowly, grateful. That night, when they finally slept on the bare concrete of an uncompleted building, David's eyes stayed open. Hunger twisted his stomach, but he ignored it. He stared into the darkness, his arms wrapped tightly around Samuel and Grace as if he could shield them from the world. His voice was low, almost a growl, as he whispered, "I will not stop. I must find a way." The words weren't just a promise. They were a covenant, a fire that burned inside him. And though no one else heard it, the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Legos tested them harder than any enemy could. Some nights rain poured in, soaking their thin clothes until they shivered uncontrollably. Other nights, area boys wandered near their hideout, their laughter rough, their shadows dangerous. David would sit at the entrance, clutching a broken bottle like a weapon, praying they wouldn't come closer. Grace and Samuel curled behind him, how too scared to sleep. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. Grace's body weakened further, her cough deepening. Samuel grew quieter, his laughter gone, his innocence fading. Yet David refused to surrender. He began hawking sachet water, borrowing 1,000 from a roadside food seller who took pity on them. "I'll pay you back," he promised. That morning, he carried a bucket of pure water on his head, shouting along with other hawkers, "Pure water! Cold water! Buy from me!" Cars splashed him with muddy water. Conductors shouted at him to move. Some drivers ignored him entirely. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone would buy. 50 here, 100 there. By evening, he made 1,300. He used what he could to buy cheap medicine for Grace, crushing the tablets into water and feeding her carefully. "Drink," he said softly. "You'll be fine." She looked at him through watery eyes and whispered, "Thank you, David. You're more than a brother. You're my father now." He swallowed hard, his chest tight, and nodded without speaking. Samuel lay beside her, eyes heavy with exhaustion, his hand clutching David's arm as if it were the only anchor keeping him from drowning. Still, the city never stopped pressing them. One morning, Grace tried to follow David into the market to help, but a Danfo conductor slapped her when she brushed against his bus. She stumbled back, humiliated, her cheek burning. David's fists clenched, but he held back. He couldn't risk losing the little they had by fighting. Another day, Samuel fainted from hunger in the middle of the street. David carried him through the crowd, shouting for help. Most people ignored them. A woman finally gave him a small loaf of bread, muttering, "God will see you." David tore it into 3 pieces, even though Samuel was the one who needed it most. At night, as the city roared and they lay in their broken shelter, Grace whispered, "David, maybe God has forgotten us." His eyes burned, but his voice was steady. "No, God never forgets. One day, things will change." His words were both a prayer and a vow. He sat awake long after they slept, staring into the darkness, his hands blistered, his body aching, but his spirit unbroken. And though Legos tried to swallow them, though hunger and humiliation pressed them to the ground, David's eyes still carried a fire. He would not let go. He could not let go. And so, in the middle of chaos, poverty, and despair, a decision was made in the heart of a boy too young to carry such weight. David refused to surrender to the streets. He would fight, crawl, beg, and bleed if he had to. But his siblings would survive. As the rain tapped against the broken walls of the uncompleted building, he whispered again into the night, "We will rise. I swear it." He didn't know when. He didn't know how. But something in him refused to die. And that was how the Okafor children began their long battle with survival. The pain of losing his parents never left David. Even as months turned into years, the wound remained raw. At night, he often lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of their tiny room, hearing echoes of his father's laughter, his mother's gentle voice calling them to dinner. The memory burned deeper whenever he thought of the day the uncles shut the gate against them. Sometimes anger rose in his chest like fire he could not quench. He wanted to hate them forever. He wanted to curse their names. But whenever he looked at Grace and Samuel, thin and fragile beside him, he swallowed the anger and turned it into fuel. One evening, exhausted from hawking, he sat by the roadside, head buried in his hands. For a brief moment he dozed, and in that half-sleep he saw them, his parents. His father stood tall, dressed in his usual white shirt, his mother in her flowing gown, smiling the way she used to on Sunday mornings. They didn't speak much. They didn't have to. His father placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and steady, while his mother nodded with tears in her eyes. "Be strong," his father said. "Hold your siblings together." David jerked awake, his eyes wet, his chest burning. That night, as Grace and Samuel slept, he whispered into the silence, "We will come out of this strong and healthy. I promise." The next morning, with his father's voice echoing in his heart, he walked into Mama Chinier's provision shop and begged her to let him resell her goods. That decision became the first step in changing their story. The streets had not been kind to the Okafor children, but David refused to bow to them. Each morning before the first yellow buses screeched awake, he was already on his feet, carrying a bucket of sachet water on his head, his voice hoarse from shouting, "Pure water? Cold water." Sometimes he returned with profits, sometimes with nothing but blistered feet and aching bones. But little by little, coin by coin, a seed was growing. It began the day Mama Chinier, after long hesitation, handed him cartons of biscuits and sweets. "If you fail me, I won't give you again," she warned. That day David hawked until his legs wobbled, until sweat soaked his shirt, until his voice cracked. By evening he returned every kobo, placing the money carefully in her hands. She studied him, her wrinkled face softening. "You're a good boy," she said. "God bless you." From then on, his hustle began to shift. Soon he had his own small wooden table near the market junction, stocked with biscuits, sachet water, ground nuts, and soft drinks. Grace and Samuel often helped him arrange the goods. Samuel, still small, shouted at passersby with a wide smile, "Buy Gala. Buy La Casera." Grace scribbled sales into a torn notebook, her handwriting neat, her mind already dreaming of more. "David," she said one evening as they counted the day's earnings, This is something." "You've turned suffering into something." David only nodded, his chest swelling quietly. He had promised himself that his siblings would not drown in Lagos. Slowly, that promise was coming alive. It wasn't easy. Some nights David returned home with bruises from market fights, his shirt torn from being pushed aside by bigger traders. Grace's cough lingered for months, sometimes so bad that she could barely rise from the mat. Samuel often cried from hunger when sales were poor. Yet in those moments, David refused despair. He would kneel by Grace's side, hold her hand, and whisper, "You will be fine, Nin. One day you will be stronger than all of them. You'll stand in court and fight for justice. I believe it." She would smile weakly, her voice soft but steady. "And you, David, you'll own companies bigger than Daddy's." Samuel, listening quietly, would add, "And I'll build big houses for all of us." Their dreams were fragile but powerful, like candles flickering in the dark. David pushed harder each day, saving what little he could. One term, he surprised Grace by paying her school fees at a local public secondary school. She stared at him, tears spilling down her cheeks. "David, how? How did you do this?" He shrugged, trying to hide the ache in his body from endless hustling. "Don't ask. Just study. I want you back in school." Grace hugged him tightly, her tears wetting his shirt. Samuel returned too, his laughter slowly creeping back as he joined a nearby primary school. They didn't wear the neat uniforms of their past life, but even in second-hand clothes, the siblings walked with pride. They had nothing, yet in each other, they had everything. One evening, after a long day at his stall, David returned to their small one-room apartment, a place they had managed to rent after months of hawking. The walls were cracked, the ceiling leaked when it rained, and the bathroom was shared with other families, but to the Okafor children, it was a palace compared to the uncompleted building they once called home. That night, they sat together on the floor, eating a small plate of rice they had bought with the day's earnings. Samuel leaned back against the wall, sighing with contentment. "This is the best rice I've ever eaten." Grace laughed softly. "Samuel, every rice is the best rice to you." David smiled, watching them, his body aching but his spirit steady. "We'll eat better rice one day. Real jollof, with chicken and suya." Grace looked at him, her eyes shining. "We will, and when we do, I'll stand and make a speech, thanking my brother for not giving up." David chuckled, shaking his head. "No speeches, please." But deep inside, those words wrapped around him like armor. That night, before they slept, they prayed together. David's voice trembled as he said, "God, thank you for today. Thank you for life. We may not have much, but we have each other. Please give me strength to keep going." When he opened his eyes, he found Grace and Samuel staring at him with quiet admiration. In their eyes, he was more than a brother. He was their lifeline. The months rolled into years. David's small provision table grew into a wooden stall, then into a shop with painted boards and shelves stacked higher than Samuel's head. Grace excelled in school, winning a scholarship that covered her fees. Samuel grew into a bright teenager, quick with numbers, often helping David calculate profits. Every day brought new battles, landlords shouting for rent, market taxes squeezing their pockets, hunger always at the door, but every day also brought small victories. Grace's scholarship, Samuel's return to class, David's expanding business. They held on to those victories as tightly as drowning people cling to driftwood. On Grace's birthday one year, David surprised her with a small cake, bought with a day's profit. She stared at it in disbelief, her hand trembling. You remembered?" David smiled faintly. "How can I forget? You're my sister." She hugged him tightly, whispering, "I'll never forget this." Samuel's laughter filled the room as he smeared icing on his face, the room echoing with a sound they thought they had lost forever. And though their lives were still wrapped in struggle, joy began to slip in between the cracks. They were still fighting, still sacrificing, but they were no longer drowning. They were rising. And so, as the years stretched on, the Okafor children began to change. The streets had scarred them, yes, but the scars became fuel. The hunger had broken them, yes, but it also gave them fire. Their laughter returned in small bursts. Their hope returned in fragile sparks. And slowly, brick by brick, day by day, their lives began to rebuild. Years passed, and everything began to change. 15 years later, the city of Lagos told a different story about the Okafor children. The same streets that once spat them out now whispered their names with respect. David, once a barefoot hawker, had grown into a man whose presence commanded attention. His provision table had multiplied into warehouses, trucks bearing his company's name rumbling across the city. Market men who once mocked him now greeted him with a bow. "Okagu," they called him. Grace, once the coffin girl with torn notebooks, now walked in fine suits, her name echoing in the courts of law. She was known for her fearless arguments, her voice sharp as a blade, her heart still burning for justice. Samuel, the boy who once fainted from hunger, now stood tall as an engineer, his blueprints shaping estates and rising structures across Lagos. Together they had turned scars into stepping stones, hunger into hunger for greatness. Their laughter, once fragile, now filled spacious rooms. Their dreams, once whispered in darkness, now blazed under the sun. But while the siblings rose, their enemies fell. The uncles who once strutted in flowing agbadas, boasting in front of their friends, now wore faded clothes and carried sagging faces. Their children, spoiled by ill-gotten wealth, had squandered everything. Lavish parties, reckless spending, no discipline, no legacy. One uncle's son crashed 3 cars in 1 year, while another gambled away properties his father had stolen. Businesses crumbled under greed and carelessness, leaving nothing but debts and shame. As poverty crept into their homes, sickness followed. Malaria that lingered too long. Diabetes left untreated. Knees bent under the weight of age and regret. The once proud men who locked out children at their gate now sat outside chemists' shops, waiting for medicine they could no longer afford. The lawyer who had forged their betrayal also fell from grace. His once polished office was abandoned. Clients stopped coming. He too aged with guilt in his eyes, carrying a secret that burned like acid inside him. Sometimes, news of their downfall reached the siblings. Grace would hear whispers in the court corridors. "Do you know Chief Okafor's brother? He's nothing now." David's drivers would return from delivery saying, "Oga, I saw one of your uncles begging in the street." Samuel would sit in meetings and overhear engineers mocking the ruins of a once powerful family. And though bitterness still lingered in their hearts, the siblings did not rejoice. They remembered the nights of hunger, the humiliation, the gate locked in their faces. But they also remembered the promise they made to themselves: to rise, not to sink into the same pit of cruelty. So instead of laughing at their enemies, they worked harder. David expanded his business to neighboring states. Grace fought for children abandoned by greedy relatives, winning case after case. Samuel designed schools in rural villages, determined that no child would wander homeless like they once did. Their success became a rebuke sharper than words, their very existence a living proof that love endures while greed destroys. And yet, in the quiet corners of Lagos, another story was brewing. The lawyer, now a shadow of his former self, lived each day with trembling hands and sleepless nights. His neighbors often heard him talking to himself, pacing in the darkness, whispering words no one could understand. At times, his eyes filled with tears when children passed by on their way to school. At times, he clutched his chest as though something heavy pressed against it. For 15 years, he had carried a burden too dark to confess. And though the city didn't know and the Okafor siblings didn't know, the truth sat waiting silent, sharp, and ready to tear the past open. Something was coming, something that would shake the foundations of everything. The weight of guilt had finally broken the lawyer. For 15 years, he had carried a truth too heavy for any man. One stormy evening, rain drumming against the rusted roof of his crumbling house, he sat at a wooden table with a bottle of gin shaking in his hand. His skin was pale, his eyes bloodshot, his chest rising with labored breaths. "God, forgive me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have destroyed lives, innocent lives." His trembling fingers reached into the drawer and pulled out a brown envelope, dusty with age. On it was written, in bold ink, "The last will and testament of Chief Okafor." His tears spilled freely as he pressed the envelope against his chest. "I betrayed them. For greed. But I cannot die with this in my hands. That night he walked into the darkness, his clothes soaked, his body shivering, but his mind clear. He found his way to Grace's office the next morning, his knees trembling as he stood in front of her desk. She looked up in shock, recognizing the face of the man who had once destroyed their world. "What are you doing here?" she asked coldly. He broke into sobs, dropping the envelope at her feet. "I cannot carry this any longer," he wept. "Your father, he left everything to you. We lied. We stole. Forgive me." Grace froze, her body stiff as ice, her hands trembling as she picked up the envelope. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting of her father, the seal of the court, the signatures. Her knees buckled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "It's real," she whispered. "Oh, God." It's real. The revelation tore through the city like wildfire. Newspapers carried the headlines. Okafor will discovered after 15 years. The story spread across Lagos, on buses, in markets, in offices. People spoke of nothing else. The betrayal that had robbed 3 children of their future was now exposed. Court hearings began almost immediately, the atmosphere electric. On the day of the trial, the courtroom overflowed with journalists, lawyers, and curious onlookers. Grace stood tall in her black gown, her voice steady but sharp as a blade. "My lords," she said, holding up the will, "this document proves that my father, Chief Okafor, left his entire estate to his children, David, Grace, and Samuel. For 15 years, this will was hidden by those who should have protected us. Instead, they conspired with this lawyer to throw us into the streets. Today, we seek not only restoration, but justice." The uncles sat hunched in the dock, their shoulders slumped, their faces hollow. No longer draped in agbatas and gold chains, they now wore rumpled shirts, faded wrappers, and cheap plastic sandals. Their once proud heads were bowed low, their eyes darting nervously as if searching for escape. The proud men who once shut children out of their father's gate now looked like shadows of themselves, tired, broken, and stripped of all respect. Beside them sat the disgraced lawyer, his suit stained and wrinkled, his trembling hands clutching his knees as if they were his only anchor. The entire courtroom stared at them, not with fear, but with contempt and pity. The courtroom echoed with gasps as Grace read portions of the will aloud, her voice breaking but strong. David and Samuel sat behind her, their eyes wet, their hearts pounding. For a moment, the pain of 15 years came rushing back, the hunger, the humiliation, the endless nights of despair. But now, they were no longer powerless children. They were men and women standing in the light of truth. The judge's voice thundered as he delivered the verdict. "This court recognizes the validity of Chief Okafor's will. All properties, businesses, and estates are to be returned to his rightful heirs, David Okafor, Grace Okafor, and Samuel Okafor. Furthermore, those who conspired to hide this will and strip these children of their inheritance are guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and perjury." The courtroom erupted, reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, spectators gasped. The uncles wept openly, their bodies shaking, their pride in ashes. The lawyer fell to his knees, clutching the hem of his robe, crying, "Forgive me. Forgive me." Grace looked at him, her face a storm of emotions. "Forgiveness is God's gift, not mine," she said quietly, "but justice must be done." David stood slowly, his voice deep and firm. "You thought you destroyed us, but you only made us stronger. You left us in the streets to die, but God kept us alive. Today we stand, not just for ourselves, but for every child betrayed by those meant to protect them." Samuel placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, his voice steady. "This is not just our victory. This is God's justice." The entire courtroom fell silent, the weight of their words pressing on every soul present. When the case was over, the Okafor siblings walked out of the court surrounded by flashing cameras and cheering crowds. Their names were no longer whispered in pity, they were shouted in admiration. They returned to their father's estate, once stolen, now restored. Standing in the grand compound where they once played as children, the memories came rushing back. Grace fell to her knees on the marble floor, her tears wetting the ground. Samuel walked through the halls, his fingers brushing against the walls, whispering, "We are home." David stood in the center, his face lifted to the sky, his chest heaving with emotion. "Daddy! Mummy! We kept your promise. We came out strong. We came out healthy." The siblings embraced tightly, their tears mingling. their hearts pounding with gratitude and grief all at once. In that moment, they were no longer the abandoned children of Legos. They were survivors. They were conquerors. They were proof that love endures, even when greed tries to bury it. And, as the sun set behind the estate, casting golden light over the Okafor legacy, their story closed with a truth so clear that every ear in Lagos repeated it. Greed destroys, but love and resilience endure forever.